In today's video, we're going to take the JSAR HAWK, completely tear it down to its prime parts, and then we're going to reassemble it. So we're going to get started. Before we start though, the standard rule is you want to make sure that the weapon is decocked. There is no ammo in it at all. There is no pressure. You want to get all the pressure out of it, and so that way we're good and safe. What you're going to need for tools is a 4mm, 3mm, 2.5, and a 2mm Allen wrench. I use both the handled versions and the offset versions for leverage. You'll need a pick tool of some sort that allows you to put small pieces and parts in, like the O-rings, without cutting them. So while it's pointy, it's not sharp. We don't want to cause any damage. You're going to want some kind of a silicone lube and a towel to clean your hands so you don't make a mess of everything, and then just a Phillips screwdriver. So we're going to get started here, taking this old boy apart. Okay guys, we're going to go ahead and take off the bottle. The gun will be depressurized, there's no air in it, and when this tank comes off, there is no pin in the regulator. So if you take this off, it'll degas and all the air will come out of it. We'll safely be able to move that out of the way. The next thing we're going to need is a 4mm Allen. We're going to take out these 3 screws. We'll show you the 3 that we're going to take out. And there'll be a long one on the other side. That's one. The other one comes up through the bottom here. That's number 2. And on the other side, we're going to deal with the long one that comes all the way through, and it'll be another one like this. Again, those are all 4mm. And you may have noticed that all 3 of these that are in this perimeter, bottom and the 2 sides, are all the same length. This guy is fully length, goes all the way through the stock and the other side. Okay, now we'll take our 3mm and we're just going to loosen the clamshell so that we can get this plastic shroud piece off. Now that this is loose, we should be able to spread it, and it slides right off the end of the bottle drop. We'll just set that there for now. We're going to turn the rifle back over. Now that we have the tank off of it, we're going to go ahead and get the safety off, which is a Phillips screw that comes straight up from the bottom. Very, very short, small guy. And then the switch slide comes off of that. Make sure that safety is forward so when we go to take this out of the stock, it's not catching. The next is going to be a Phillips screw right here on the bottom that holds the action down into the wood stock. We'll remove that. At this point, the action can be removed from the stock. All we're going to do is just push it straight up and out, and our action is now there ready for us. Okay, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take the barrel shroud off, and I'm going to leave all of the pieces at the bottom, which are going to be the end cap and the rest. If you want to see how this comes apart, you can look at the video that I did for barrel access and shroud removal. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just unscrewing this as an assembly, and I'm going to go ahead and slide it off. And we're going to put that out of the way. Okay, at this point we have our barrel, pressure tube, and our action all out of the stock, and we're going to start taking this apart and we're getting it down smaller. First thing we're going to do is we're going to leave the air stripper on, and we're going to deal with this barrel as an assembly. So what I'm going to do is loosen this guy in the top, which should be a 2.0mm Allen. Loosen that. On these, I like to take them out completely, and the reason I like to remove these completely is these screws sometimes have a tendency to stick down, and if there's any O-rings that try to come past that, it will gouge it on its way by. That's what's keeping our barrel in the breech here. And so now I'm just pulling this, I'm not fully cocking, I'm just getting it back out of the way. And holding this firmly, I'm just going to take the barrel and rotate while I slowly pull it out. Now you can see I'm going back and forth, but I'm trying to keep this parallel and straight, not cocking and yanking very, very hard. This is how O-rings get scalped when you pull too hard. Notice the little rock back and forth, very, very easily. Just keep doing that until we get the barrel out. Now our barrel is out. We see the flat spot that grub screw was on. There's our two barrel O-rings. There's our transfer port that comes up through. So our barrel will just be up there out of the way. Now we're down to the small section, which is the action pressure tube in our cocking mechanism. What we're going to do at this point is loosen these guys that hold in the drop block for our pressure to the bottle to go on. These will be 4 millimeters. These will be in there pretty tight. You got to have a very good set of Allen wrenches to get these out, something good in quality. If you want to use something with a little leverage to break them loose, and then you can use a handled version to take them the rest of the way out. It's important to notice that these bolts are shouldered so that they fit down inside the pressure tube. They're not sitting on top with a lock washer. They literally sit down in the tube. So all of the energy that's being pushed on this fastener is pushed against this edge, not the threads. So it's a good way to make a fastener. With all 3 of these old boys out, we now have our bottle block assembly ready to go. And there's going to be O-rings in here. So again, we're coming past steel with holes in it. So we want to be very careful when we're pulling this thing by. And I'll show you the technique that I use. I just simply prop my tube up on either shot bags, sandbags, something just so it's up off the table. And then all I'm doing is really supporting that with a firm hand. And I'm taking this and turning slightly as I'm drawing out. Just a little back and forth. Notice it's not a lot of turning and I'm not yanking hard. It's just a little back and forth. Just a wiggle. That's all I'm doing. And once we get to the hole, you'll notice those O-rings kind of puff up. They rise up and they can get sheared off. This is where that little tool I was talking about that we can use to push these O-rings down past that hole so they don't get scalped. Now this is going to be at each one of the holes, this side and the top. We just got to keep our eye on them so we don't scalp them. The minute I get close to the edge, I'm taking that tool and just pushing them in so that they're not pushed up through the hole. Now if you have plenty of O-rings and you don't really care, you can just yank this out and replace them. I like to try to maintain as many of the original parts as I can. And you can see on this here how far that O-ring has pushed up. It's almost completely through the hole. This one too. So you could see that if that were really pulled, it would just destroy that O-ring. So we just got to tuck it back down in there. And I'm deliberately taking as long as I can on this so you guys can see that this isn't a fast procedure. It takes some finesse, and you don't want to rush this because you'll gouge those O-rings and you won't be happy. Now the Jefferson State Air Rifles Hawk comes with a set of O-rings, but you don't want to use them if you don't have to. Now that I have those O-rings, almost every one of them almost past the hole, I can then start twisting it out for the final 1/8 of an inch for it to come out. And there we go. So we've got our block out, our O-rings are good, there's no gouges on the O-rings, they're nice, pristine, no problems. We'll get that off to the side. At this point, we're going to go ahead and remove our trigger assembly, which is Phillips screws on the bottom here, 2 of them. And once we take this out, we can take this trigger group and just set it off to the side. When you take out the forwardmost screw, the nut that it tightens into is literally just a loose nut, and it'll tend to fall into the pressure tube on top of the hammer the minute you take the screw out. So when you take this screw out, the nut falls down inside. I'm going to go ahead and shake it out like that. And you can see the way that this nut is designed. It's square so that it fits down through this hole, fits down through the hole, and these little wings that you see are on the back side. So when it comes time for us to put this together, we're going to have to use gravity on our side to put this in, turn this upside down so it sits in there, and then we've got to get the screw in. This is the biggest pain in the neck of taking this thing apart, is that nut. Everything else is simple. That's the only part that's challenging in my opinion. Okay, at this point we're going to take the stock saddle, which is this guy here. We're going to pull that off, and that'll be a 2.5 mil, one on each side. We'll go ahead and get that loose. Actually, I think it's a 3. Hang on. No, it's 2.5. So 2.5. And we'll flip it over and get the other one off. And that's that saddle that goes across the pressure tube that allows the stock to be held down. We have this top screw that we're going to take out, which is for our adjuster assembly. But first, if we look down inside the tiny little screw that's used to tell us what our preload is, we really want to make sure we take that out first. And be very careful with this guy because it only screws into a plastic washer in there. So take our adjuster indicator out, that little screw. Now we can take out our actual adjustment screw. Which is a 3mm. And I'm putting my hand here on purpose because if there's any tension on that, I want to make sure that if I'm holding it, you can see the spring was pushing slightly. So I just want to make sure it doesn't shoot out. This assembly here is going to be where our preload comes from in our spring. And this is the part that turns to adjust to either push the spring, compress the spring, or to relax the spring. So that would be for our power adjuster. Last thing that we want to do here is we want to take our breech block off of the top of the pressure tube. And there's going to be a series of 4 screws that come in through the top. It's important that you pay attention. The forward screw and the rearward screw are different lengths. So pay attention when you take these out, and I'll show you, I'll give you a demonstration. If you notice, that's the forward screw. And this is the rear screw. Notice how much longer the forward one is? So you want to keep that in mind when you're putting this thing back together again. Now at this point I'm loosening. I'm going to take the short one out first. And on this last one I'm just going to take my hand and I'm going to hold the assembly together like this. This way when I take that last screw out, everything doesn't fall apart and I lose where I'm at. Because then there's going to be a transfer port in here that we don't want to lose, so we want to make sure that we capture that. So now that these two are apart, I'm going to slightly lift up on this. I'm going to do this on an angle so you guys can see. Normally I would do this straight up, so I've used gravity to keep the transfer port in place. And all I'm doing is lifting straight away like this. This is now our transfer port that has a small O-ring down inside the valve, down inside there. This is our hammer that would slide back and forth to hit the valve poppet that's inside there. And underneath our upper breech, we see the transfer port itself in our cocking mechanism, which grabs the hammer. So this guy here, in a future video, I'm going to show how we're going to work on this transfer port to make a difference on increasing power. But on this one, it's just the teardown video. So now we've got the top section apart. The rest of this, you can see how the action works. It simply comes apart by loosening these Allen keys, and you can pull this apart as an assembly. There's really no need for me to get to that level of granularity in taking this thing apart. I just want to get it to the basic pieces so you can see how it comes apart and how we put it back together again. This is the transfer port. There is an O-ring on the top and the bottom. I'm going to take the transfer port out so you can see the aluminum assembly that holds it. Finger's got a lot of silicone on it, so I'm just going to wipe my hands off, and I'm going to take the port out. Just give me a second here. Okay. Now that I've got my hands clean, we can get this port out, and you can see it's really nothing more than just an aluminum collar with a shoulder on each end for the O-ring. There's an O-ring down in the bottom down there. That O-ring is the seal for the top side. This is the transfer port that I was talking about that we're going to increase so that we get better flow of air. This opening is a good size. That opening is not such a good size. So we're going to be opening that at some point, and I'll do a video on that, on how we do that. So this is our cocking mechanism. I'm just going to put that up here. Now we're dealing with just the pressure tube assembly. What we want to do is, there's a flat screwdriver here, flat blade. We're going to loosen this for the hammer to come out. Keep an eye on that. That's stainless steel. Now our hammer should slide right out the back here. We're all down to now we're looking at the pressure tube, our valve assembly, and this pin which holds the valve so that it has a good strong shoulder to sit against that won't damage anything under high pressure. This is where most manufacturers put in a series of screws that hold this thing in place. These not only have the screws from the saddle that holds the stock on, but this pin comes through, pretty much making this thing an unbelievably strong configuration. For this next portion of the video, I'm going to probably mute the sound so you don't get a headache hearing me bang on this thing, but I'm going to take a pin and a hammer, a brass hammer is what I use, and I'm going to use a drift pin, center punch like this, and I'm going to knock this pin, I'm going to drive it out, so I'm going to be tapping this through. I'll keep the camera rolling, but I'll more than likely mute the sound during this pin extraction. Okay, now that we have the pin out, that kept our valve in the location that we wanted it to, we're going to take our valve and we're going to push it out the pressure tube so that it comes out the end. We don't want to come this way because of the long burr here and here is more than likely going to cut the O-ring on that. So what I like to use is, I've got a piece of wooden dowel that's a perfect length for me to tap the valve out of the tube without causing any damage to it. And you can see that the valve is going right down toward the end, and I'm not slamming it out. I'm trying to get slow because the same thing with the O-rings that we had when we were taking the bottle block off, we want to use that same approach here. So I'm just pushing slowly to get those O-rings past these holes without damaging them. And there we go. Okay, that is our valve. There's our tube, completely disassembled down to the lowest form. This is our valve itself. If we take this end cap off, we'll get a spring and the poppet will come out. And there's our poppet with the Delrin, and that's our valve. Okay guys, that's broken down to the parts where I'm comfortable. I already did a video on the trigger and how that works. The disassembling of the cocking mechanism, if I get enough requests, I'll show a video of taking that apart. So the next part of this video is going to be putting it back together. Okay, we're going to start putting the Hawk back together again. And we're going to start with our pressure tube, making sure that this is good and clean, wiping around the edges, making sure there's no dirt, debris in here, that we got a nice clean surface to start putting things together. While we have the valve out, we just want to make sure that this O-ring is in good shape, no cuts. There can't be a single nick or anything in this surface. If there is, the gun will leak. So when looking at our pressure tube, we know this is our adjustment hole. So that means when we look at these two holes that are up top and these two holes, we want our valve, when we install it, for this shoulder that we're going to be putting in there is going to be down here. And that's right where that valve pin is going to come right through this guy here. So when we insert this, we're going to want that down. So our pressure tube, our pressure transfer port lines up here. And so it should stop right about there and everything should be aligned. So what we're going to do is get this guy back together again by taking our poppet, drop it in so the spring is sticking up, and put the cap back on. It's good and tight. The O-ring that's at the end, I like to put silicone grease both on the O-ring and on my finger. So what I do is take a little bit of silicone grease and I just work it around that O-ring. And then whatever's left on my fingers, I just put inside the tube. Just around the tube like that. Now, because we want up, that's our transfer port hole, that's the top. So we're going to want this at the top. And we're going to try to keep that orientation as we're putting the valve in so that we're semi-close when we come to the end. Using just our fingers, take the valve and slowly push it in, keeping an eye on that O-ring when it gets to the side of each one of these holes, making sure that it's not catching on anything. We're going to take our little tool, give each hole right at the O-ring, just give it a little rub to make sure that it's not caught. And we're going to take our finger and just easily push that through, like that. So at this point, we're going to start pushing the valve down until we get this pinhole lined up so that we can get our pin back through. I'll be honest with you, this is where a lot of people overdo it. When you're pushing this thing back in, you want to go nice and slow with it, okay? Push it down, keep it nice and slow. There's our first little portion of the shoulder. We're getting close to the second. We'll see the opening in a minute. Here it comes, starting to line up with the hole right there. So that I know that it's starting to line up, I stop and I take that drift pin that we used and I let it help me get this in the right rotation so that I've got a clear view all the way through, like that. That's where that valve's in the right spot. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and knock our pin back in again, like I said on the previous one, so that you guys don't get a headache. I'll probably just mute the sound. Okay, at this point we're even on the left and the right, so we know we have it in the right position. It's centered the way it should be. We have our transfer pointed up. What I did was installed the transfer port into the top of the breech already with the O-ring sitting up on top, so that's good to go. So the next part we want to do here is we want to get our hammer ready to go in here. So we want to look at our hammer. If you turn it over, you notice there's no holes on the bottom. There's one hole in the top, and that's for that pin that we took out so that when the cocking mechanism pulls back, it draws our hammer back. So we want that hole to come up through this slot. Putting that in, just taking a tool to line that hole up so we can see it. I can see it in the slot now. Taking the take the flat screwdriver, put it in the slot, and we're going to go ahead and get that into the hammer. And remember guys, any of this stuff that goes in, if it starts being difficult to turn, chances are it's cross-threading, so you want to stop. Don't force anything. Just put a little tweak on it. You'll notice that when you took this out, whatever this orientation is, kind of remember it. In other words, if it were pointing forward and back, try to put it at the same spot so you know you're not over or under torquing and you know you got it in the right spot. taking it and just pushing it forward, that lets me know that I've got nothing in its way. It slides very, very easily. Okay, we're going to take our spring and our adjuster, and we're going to, if you look at this, there's a series of holes in this. There's one set of holes, if you look, is closer to the end. So I'm going to point it out here. See how this hole is closer to the end, but if we turn it over, this hole is more centered in the block. So if you look at the end of your tube, see the distance here, how this is greater, and see how this is even more. So while this is closer to the end, this is further away. So when we put this in, the one that's going to be furthest in is the one that's going to go in the bottom, like that. The one that's furthest in goes in the bottom, the other one goes in the top. So we'll take this and we're going to try to orient our adjuster here, that little hole. Remember the numbers here? We want to get that little hole to be in the right spot. So the screw that's going to go in the furthest will go on the bottom. The one that goes in is at the top. We get the right orientation. The hole for that little bitty screw is going to be pretty close to that location. Put our hammer on, our spring on our hammer. We're going to put this in as an assembly. And there we go. Okay. On this guy here, you remember it was like a mushroom head screw, which was this guy right here. I'm going to get that in. Started with my fingers. We'll get it snugged down like that. This little guy for the adjustment that shows the power, remember that was this tiny little guy that we're going to put in with a number 2. And remember, this has no structural. This is nothing more than just a guide to keep that thing from turning and to show you what your power's at. So when you put this in, it's only screwing into a plastic washer. So you just want, once it gets through that hole and it just starts to get a little resistance, stop. That's all you need to do. That's all that needs to do. Double checking to make sure you've got this in the right orientation, roll it upside down and make sure that hole's lined up. If it's not, and the screw hole is going to be too far forward, you know you've got the top down here and the hole is pushed more forward than it's supposed to be. So just remember, that's an easy way to double check. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and see if we can't get our upper section on and line up our transfer port and get those screws in to get the breech, the upper and the lower, back together again. On this, because when it's cocked back, the hammer's back, it's going to be under spring tension. We don't want that. We want this forward, so it's against the valve. We want this closed, so it's not pulling the hammer back. We want this in front. This slide is supposed to be in front of this pin so that it can pull it back to cock. So this will be closed, hammer is forward, and this, oh boy, has got to go down into that seal and line up. When we line this up, I'm going to lay this on its side so that you guys can see as I'm putting these two pieces together. What I'm doing is, it's a very easy installation. It shouldn't be forced together. It should almost fall together. So as I'm looking at the hole to line up with that transfer port, the aluminum port, all I'm doing is rocking back and forth, letting gravity help me drop it. It just dropped in just like that. Did you see it? It just fell together. Nothing should be forced. It should just fall together. And that way we know we have it right. Now, if you remember when we took this apart, I told you longer screws in the front. We'll go ahead and get those in. Shorter screws in the back. And I'm just getting these snug. I'm not tightening anything up yet. Once you get that last one in, this is when you know everything is lined up and good to go. You can now put a little torque on everything to get it set. And this is when I'll use that way I get a little feel for how much tension's on there. Again, this isn't a head going on the engine on a car. It's they're aluminum fasteners in some cases going into thin steel. So you don't know, you need to really put foot-pounds of torque on this. You got to get them snugged up like that. So our upper and lower are now together. We could put the barrel in, but it actually makes this more of a pain in the neck to work on, because remember I told you the part about this gun that is the hardest is this nut here. that has to go in and then drop down into this opening. So what we do is we drop the nut in, now it's in there, and then turning it upside down and moving it around, what we're trying to do is to get it to sit in the opening, and I'll show you what I mean by that. It really was not well thought out the way that they put this together. So now that I have it in, I'm gonna show you, I'll turn it back over and show you what I mean. So now you see I'm holding this in place so you can see the nut is in the hole and it's flush. This is the most pain in the neck about putting this thing together, because obviously if I take this tool out of the way, that's going to drop inside. And if I lay it on its side like this, while it'll stay there, the minute I go to try to put the screw in, it pushes it in. So what I found that works is I leave the screw in the forward assembly like this, so you can see the screws in there. I get my Phillips screw ready, get it all ready, and now I turn this upside down so it's down and like this, and I let it droop so gravity has this hanging down. With that like that, I take this and I bring it up underneath and I turn the screw in, hoping that it grabs the block. This is the most pain in the neck part of putting this thing together, but I'm going to try to do it live here and show you guys what I do. And holding this with one hand like this. And I'm doing it again, this is much easier when I don't have to do it for filming, but I'm trying to get it caught on film so you can see how I do it. Okay, once I got a half a thread started and I know that it's in the nut, that nut's able to be hanging onto it, then and only then do I actually turn it all the way over and I get this rearward screw started. Like I said, guys, pain in the neck. Definitely something that I think they could have done a little bit better. In one of my videos, you might remember I talked about the trigger assembly and not just cranking this thing down and tightening it. You want to pull the trigger to make sure that it isn't pressed up against the pawl, because if this is in the wrong position and you have it under pressure and tighten this down, you could destroy your trigger. So all I'm doing here is pulling this back to make sure that we're good. And in the other video, you might remember, I told you that you want to make sure that your trigger assembly is as far forward towards the front of the rifle as you can, all the way forward like that. And we're going to go ahead and tighten it down. Okay, and now just to make sure that our trigger is going to stop and catch our hammer, we're going to cock it. It's cocked, and there's an important thing I want to point out here. If you notice, our probe is not pushing in so that when we go to put the mag in, there's nothing in the way. If it's like this, then we're too far forward. The cocking mechanism needs to be all the way back, and there is nothing protruding into the hole. And you notice it's holding it, and I'll pull the trigger and decock the rifle like that. Okay? Pushing this back forward, because remember, when we put this in the action, we want that forward. Okay, we've got that portion of it done. So now what we'll do is get our block back in for our bottle block, which is this guy here, and I'll show you the technique that I use on that. On this, just like we did with the other O-ring components, I get a little bit of silicone grease on the tip of my finger here, and I just come around those O-rings to get a nice layer of grease on them. But we don't want excess. Anything that's globular, take it off. We just want a nice film on those O-rings, okay? In here, same thing. Starting in, we want to have a nice bead, not a bead, but a nice film of silicone around that. And when I sat this down, notice that I'm going to pick it back up and just double check that I don't have any particles caught in this silicone. Nice, and I'm feeling for any grit, and I don't feel any. Now, when this goes on, it goes like this. It hangs down, so the bottle is away from the top. Some folks will put it in like this, and then realize after they get 2 side screws in that they can't find the screw for the other. It has to drop like this. So here we go. We're pushing this in, and if you notice, I'm doing counterclockwise little circles and slowly working this in. Pushing it in slow, rocking it, moving it until I see the O-ring just start to touch the other side. Now I look at each hole to make sure that I'm not scalping or pinching that O-ring in any way. And here we go. We're going to just rock it in for the rest of the distance here. Again, checking each hole. These got a little bit of a looseness on them, so I'm going to take that tool of mine, flatten them down so they're not up through the hole. And rocking it in like that. Good to go. So these shoulder bolts are what we're going to put in here now. There'll be one on the top, one on the left, and one on the right. These will be the large 4mm to get those in. So what we'll do is to get it started, and that's just what we'll do, is we're just getting them started. We're not torquing them down. Once all the shoulders are started in each one of these, we then want to work the shoulders down till we start to feel them bottom out. This way we know our fasteners are all aligned and the pressure is going to be on the shoulder of the fastener, not binding up and destroying the pieces when it goes in. Now I'm setting each one of these down at the bottom and giving them a good torque so that they're good and set. At this point, that is ready to go. Now, just as a check, the O-rings here, this is where 90% of the problems happen. The O-ring that went in for the valve gets scalped, or these get scalped. That is 90% of the time where the leaks on a gun come from. So if you take the time like we just did here, carefully in putting that in, being really careful with it, you should have no problems at all. Now we're going to go ahead and get our barrel ready and get that in. So I'm going to put a little silicone on my finger here. And remember, this flat spot is what our grub screw that comes down through the top of the breech here tightens against. So we're going to want that in the up position so that we can get it closed. Now on this barrel, let's just talk about this because this is important. This is a radial port, transfer port. So there's not just one hole that transfers the air up through. There's several. So if you look, there's 1, 2, 3, comes around the radius of the barrel. So there's 3 different holes. So if you measured the size of that hole times 1, it would strangulate the airflow. But if you've got 3 of those going across and they're all coming through that, you've got great airflow. And in here, that transfer port increase that we did, that's the difference in allowing more air to get in here to increase our power. So let's go ahead and get some silicone on our O-rings, like that. I have a lot on my fingers here. I'm just going to use my towel, clean that off. Like this, and now we want our flat spot to be close towards the top like this when we're putting this in, and we're going to lay this down. Now this is the part where it just takes keeping things in line. So we don't want to try to put it in on an angle from the top. We're not going to want to be putting it in like that or like this. We want to try to be straight. Same thing here, straight. And as I'm going in, I'm turning back and forth really slow. And not forcing. It's very easy, back and forth, back and forth. And remember, this hole is almost exactly where that flat spot will be, so that tells you that you're all the way back, you're good, once we have that in. So we'll take our grub screw, which is our barrel retention screw, get that in there. Okay, we get our number 2. As I'm setting this tight, I'm wiggling the barrel to make sure I'm on the flat spot, like that. Now it's flat. I'll take a 2 right angle so that I know that I can put just a little bit of tension on it. It's about all I need right there. It's tight enough. That's good to go. We've got our barrel back on. At this point, I like to put the saddle back on, which is the other set of screws that helps hold that valve in place. Again, this is pretty simple. There's these two screws here that go right into this, that holds this onto the pressure tube, and it gives us the screw for our stock to go in. So we'll get these fingers started. When you tighten these down, you want to make sure that this isn't all the way forward or all the way back. It's right in the center like it should be. So now we'll take this and we're just going to put some tension on it so it's tight. Same thing with this guy. Okay, those are good and tight now. We're good with that, so let's get our shroud back on. And what we're going to do is, again, with the silicone, a little bit of silicone on our finger, around that O-ring, tipping this up so that we keep all of our components down in there, which is a spring, the 3 baffles, and the end cap. All we're going to do is just get a nice amount of lube here on these first set of threads so that it's nice and lubricated. Putting the piece on, we're going to turn clockwise as we're pushing in on it, slowly, not a lot of force, very easy to slide this on, pushing it down. Once this comes past that O-ring, go right past the O-ring and tighten it right down against the, compress the end of that barrel alignment at the bottom, the threaded piece at the bottom. Just going to wipe off some of this silicone. So now we have our upper lower back on, so we're going to put this back in the stock, get the stock screw back in it again. So let's get that ready. Safety is forward. Our action is ready. Taking our stock, sliding it over the action and making sure that that safety comes right through the little opening in the stock. There's a little hole for it. Once we have that, we can then, I'm going to put my weights at the other end now. Okay. Down in there, good. This is going to come up through the bottoms into our action. That's good. We'll get our safety tab back on with the 1 Phillips screw that holds that tab on. And get you more in the frame here, slightly out of frame, like that. So we get the safety in there. 1 little screw at the bottom, like that. This plastic clamshell which goes on, which has that small section of Picatinny rail, because this is open, we just simply take it, slip it over so that it lines up like that. The first screw I like to put in is the screw that comes all the way through the stock. I like putting that one on it because it keeps this in the right alignment while I'm getting the others lined up. And again, using the large 4mm, we can break down through and get that lined up. And as you remember, these 4mm go into the bottle block drop, 1 on each side and 1 on the bottom. At this point, it's all back together again. We'll wipe it down. Everything looks good to me. Safety is on, so that we know that we fit through the stock okay. I'm going to do is just really clean up a lot of the silicone that I had on it. We'll reintroduce our bottle. Get it good and tight, like that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a full teardown of the Jefferson State Hawk. Remember, guys, you want to make sure that you cock the rifle when you fill it for the first time, else the hammer pushes against the valve and lets the air out. The owner's manual does go through that. It talks through not filling it with the hammer forward, and it goes over a lot of safety details that you really want to make sure you familiarize yourself with on filling the rifle, your burst discs if they break. A lot of good information in here. Don't forget to familiarize yourself with your owner's manual. Okay guys, this is Hajimoto. We're out.